Okay, so let's start. So, welcome everybody to the Weekend Flipped webinar series, which happens every Saturday, where we get speakers from the industry and academia to come and talk on specific that would be of interest to all of you. I presume this is the fourth webinar series, and today we have Anirudh Rao. Incidentally, Anirudh has been my colleague, and we have worked together when we were both at University of Cambridge. And Anirudh did his masters at IIT Mumbai, and he has been working on several community initiatives in connecting rural users to the internet, and he's been doing a lot of software-defined networking and a lot of networking activities in the past. At Cambridge, he did some great work on edge computing, which is a emerging topic when it comes to 5G and the next thing, which is beyond 5G, which is 6G. Everyone talks about edge computing and stuff. So Anirudh has been working on edge computing, much more focused on constrained edge devices like Raspberry Pis and other devices, which are very low cost computing devices. So what he did at that point in time at Cambridge a couple of years ago, he was like one of the early pioneers who actually looked at exploring and evaluating blockchains and how such blockchains can be run on embedded devices. And I think that's a very important topic, because if you look at blockchains and obviously Bitcoin is an application that uses blockchain. What you need is pretty hardcore, powerful computing devices, etc., to run. And it all obviously something like Bitcoin consumes a lot of energy because it uses something called a proof of work, which I don't want to get into. I think Anirudh will touch on that. But the most important thing is his contribution was he managed to work on utilizing blockchains, and he evaluated how certain set of blockchains would work on constrained embedded devices. And it was just not a lab work. He also took it into the outside world, and we did a lot of deployments in Spain, which he's going to talk about. And I think this topic kind of summarizes the entire journey from the evaluation. What are blockchains? How does it work on embedded devices? What are the interesting results he saw, and some of the experiences he encountered when he went and actually deployed in a community in Spain. So Anirudh, the floor is yours. So get going. And thanks. Great to have you on board again.
Yeah. Thanks, Arjuna. I think that was a heavy introduction. I mostly work with Arjuna in Cambridge Computer Lab. Of course, he was the one who recruited me for the group he led. It's called Networking for Development, where basically the group worked on doing some multidisciplinary work to establish a universal access for internet. So today I'm going to talk about blockchains and edge computing, a match made in heaven, which we thought was a suitable topic to explain our story of whatever we explored in Cambridge Computer Lab. So today will mostly be a story talking rather than deep technical talk of a lot of heavy blockchain technologies. And yeah, of course, I'll talk about some relevant technology and part of blockchain technology that is relevant to the context that we are talking. But yeah, so I just want to give a prologue to the talk and then start the talk. So yeah. So before anything, I just want to give a disclaimer that this work, whatever we are presenting, is at individual capacity, and it doesn't represent views of any of the affiliations that I currently hold with any of the organizations. So going forward with whatever I told, that I want to give a prologue to or build up to the story that we really worked on. So 2017 and 18, end of 2017 and early 2018, I was part of InfoD Lab headed by Arjuna, who is one of the co-founders of Gaius and who is also one of the who just introduced me here. So as I told you, N4D worked on some cross-disciplinary approaches to establish a universal internet access, address a lot of problems. So we basically worked as a group. We worked with rural communities and some of the backward communities in Africa and some of the community-based networking communities in Spain. So one collaboration that I could closely relate to is collaboration with UPC, with Professor Leandro's group, and Goofy.net, where we did this evaluation of blockchains and edge computing together. So so when I went into Cambridge Computer Lab, I started exploring on some sort of uh, 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 platforms where I can deploy applications on top of resource constrained devices like Raspberry Pis. I started exploring Dockers and unikernels, and then with already a bunch of problems that were present with our in our hand with respect to community mesh networks or rural broadband, etc. So we went ahead and thought, why not explore blockchains, which was seemingly giving out a lot of relatable solutions in this area. So that's how it started. Uh, so in this talk, I'll just give an introduction to blockchains and then some characteristics of blockchains which are pretty relevant to whatever we want to address with respect to blockchains and edge computing together. Uh, and then what are the blockchain candidates that we chose to deploy? What are the characteristics of each of them? And then what was the deployment strategy and things like that? And then we go ahead and talk about some context relevant characteristics of edge computing and what did we choose there, what platform we chose there, and then how did we go about it. And then finally, so as I told you, there are like some existing problems that we already had in our hand. So we want to also I want to also talk about saying how this blockchains and edge computing together would solve that problem. So as the topic says, so I just want to explain why do we think this marriage is necessary. And then we finally did some deployment and then went ahead and tested it in the actual wireless mesh network, and got some interesting results. So we'll present those interesting results as well, and then let's decide whether it's a successful marriage. So that's how I want to go about it. Yeah. So let's start with blockchains. So as you can see in the figure, so it's basically a sort of database with blocks of data, and each block of data is linked to other in a form of chain. And with a general definition that's available, the blockchain is called as an append-only immutable data structure. So these terms, append-only immutable, I'll probably explain further whenever I get into explaining some structure of blockchain, and then present some characteristics of it. But yeah, so the on a general at a higher level, so it's basically blocks of data going together, and the blocks of data are chained together. That's why it's called as blockchain. Uh, and then coming to the first implementation of blockchain, it was basically Bitcoin around 2009, I think. It was pretty popular. It rose in popularity because anybody could join and it could mine, and then there was, I don't know if I can call it rumor, but yeah, the way it went, like you can still go ahead and earn money. So that's how it was. You can mine and get some bitcoins, which was exchangeable to some sort of money or building your wealth. So one thing that Bitcoin did, which was revolutionary, was it solved double spending problem. So to just put across what a double spending problem is. So for example, in a digital world, if I give a set of my digital assets, say probably if I give my 10 bitcoins to somebody, and if I somebody say B, and then if I give the same 10 bitcoins to somebody called C, that's called double spending. So this was earlier solved in a centralized fashion. Like you have a central trusted party which would tell you how this double spending problem would be solved. But Bitcoin came up with some sort of algorithm and a protocol which would solve this double spending problem in a decentralized fashion. That was revolutionary. And you didn't require a trusted third party or a trusted agency in the center in a centralized fashion to solve this problem. So that's how blockchain, Bitcoin became pretty popular. And then, so yeah, this basically when you are in a world outside, so it's and if it's a public sort of setup and you don't have any third party, so you basically don't trust on anybody. There's no centralized trust here. So this problem of trust was being addressed here, and Bitcoin induced some sort of removed some sort of trust dependency on transactions, and still keeping it very valid. So let's look into how it was really addressed. So before that, let me tell a bit about what exactly makes blockchains. So as I told you in the earlier slides, there is a blocks of data that are connected in a chain format. Uh, Before that, let me explain. There is one sort of technology where your database is distributed across multiple nodes. So that's the mother of blockchains. So it's called distributed ledger technology. And then basically in distributed ledger technology, you have data, same replica of data split over multiple nodes or multiple servers or things like that. So in that way, it makes somebody to hamper the data difficult. So now if you earlier in a centralized database, probably if you just got an access to the central database, it was fine and you could go ahead and change it or tamper it. But now with multiple copies of it present over different places throughout the world, maybe, so it's difficult to go ahead and attack and change the entries in the database. So that was one very good thing that distributed ledger technology gave. And then since it's the same copies of data was present everywhere, so every time a new transaction or a new update came to the database, so it was supposed to go into all the copies. So there was some sort of technique required, which would make sure that valid transactions or valid entries get into the table, and that process is called consensus. So the ledger was updated based on some sort of consensus between multiple nodes that existed in the network. So now coming to blockchains. So what exactly is a blockchain? So blockchain is also a distributed ledger, but it has some additional properties or attributes. So basically, again, even in blockchains, the data or replicas of data exist in multiple nodes. In fact, in many nodes, if you consider Bitcoin or Ethereum. And then the data comes in, or the data is updated in terms of chunks or blocks. And again, it follows the same method of consensus. So what really makes the difference to DLT? Is it the block? Okay, so now what if the block size is 1? Is it really DLT? No, even though even if the block size is 1, there is one more property which would make the blockchain stand out of distributed ledger technology. There is a link between one block to the other block, which is not really present in the distributed ledger technology. So that's why it's called a blockchain. So I've just pulled out one blockchain diagram of Bitcoins, a couple of blocks of Bitcoin, which was put in Wikipedia. So this is how a blockchain of a Bitcoin looks. Generally, this is how a blockchain looks. This is very similar to whatever I showed you in the first slide. So what really happens is there are a lot of transactions. If you see these transactions, so there are, if you see block 11, there are probably like 4 transactions. You hash them, and in the header you have the hash of the transaction root, as well as something called timestamp and something called nonce and the previous hash. So the main difference, the main thing that makes a difference to a blockchain from distributed ledger technology is this previous hash. So basically, whenever you're making a new block, you hash the entire block 11's header or the previous block's header and then put it into the next block. So this sort of creates a level of security, making it immutable. For example, assume now the blocks propagated further, and now the block number is 16 or 17, and somebody wants to come and tamper, say, transaction 1 in block 11. So if transaction 1 is changed, then hash 1 changes, hash 01 changes, and then tx root changes because of this block 11's hash changes. And since it goes into block 12, so the hash of block 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, whatever is existing further keeps changing. So if an attacker has to really attack, he has to not only make changes or make sort of changes in all the ledgers that are present in all the places, which is definitely not possible. And then he also has to propagate these changes to the current block until the current block. So that's one main differentiator that blockchain gets, or blockchain brings in, and that's the definition. That's why the definition thing, it's a immutable data structure, append only immutable data structure. Yeah, so going ahead, I'll explain a couple of characteristics of blockchains, which I think are relevant to our context. So one of them is consensus again. So uh, in case of in case of general, if you see Bitcoin or Ethereum, so consensus is established with solving a puzzle. So what happens is, for example, somebody, there is a block of transaction with a miner. So for him to provide the next block of data, he has to solve a puzzle with some constraints. So if you see the previous slide, there is something called nonce here. So this is sort of a magic number, especially in terms of Bitcoin. This is a sort of magic number which you are allowed to change with some restrictions, and then you are supposed to solve a puzzle which would give the block hash with defined restrictions again. Like for example, your hash has to be less than some value, or your hash has to have like 10 zeros in the beginning, or 11 zeros in the beginning, something like that. So whoever solves first will make this. Any miner who wants to solve this problem will assemble the transactions and then go ahead and then find the nonce which would give you this hash, which would satisfy whatever the puzzle has given, and then propagate it. So once that happens, once the miner is able to solve the puzzle and then puts it forward to the other peers in the network, so the peers verify it, and then they agree upon it. If they think it's valid, all the transactions are valid, and also the puzzle is solved properly. So this is a sort of consensus approach that public or blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum take up. So yeah, so let me explain you further. Going further, I'll explain you to you about what's the difference between various techniques that I've mentioned here. So proof of work is the one that we started with, and Ethereum slowly wants to move towards proof of stake, which was supposed to happen in January 2020, and then I think that has not happened, and it will be planned somewhere in 2021 probably. So as we get into some sort of approach in blockchains where we want to have a private setup or permission setup, there we need not have very computationally resourceful sort of approaches like proof of work or proof of stake. We could have a lighter consensus approaches, so which is where we come up with proof of authority, Raft, and PBFT. So let me go ahead and explain the two new terms that I introduced previously. So I talked about private and permission setup, what they really mean. So when you characterize a blockchain setup, you can characterize it in multiple ways. So one of the ways is you can characterize them as permissioned or permissionless. So basically, permissionless is anything where anybody can join into the network without revealing their identity to anybody or asking anybody's permission. So basically, there's nobody stopping you to join. So this is how Bitcoin or the Ethereum main network works. So you just join and keep mining, and there are some incentives on mining. So you earn some Bitcoins and things like that. So now coming to permission, so somebody has to approve your identity or some sort of pseudo identity, probably, like where you have to be identified, and then only you'll be let into. So that's a permission setup. So there is also one more sort of approach where you can characterize blockchains into public and private. So if the data is available publicly, then it's called public blockchain. So again, cryptocurrencies like Ethereum and Bitcoin are public. And then you can have a private setup where the data is not visible to everybody, and it's probably to only one organizations or only a couple of organizations. So that's one sort of setup we follow. There are a couple of combinations possible with this. One is public permissionless, which is basically Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then public permission. So the data is available, but you need to have some sort of identity to get in. So that's something like public services, like for example, land records or health record. You need to reveal your Aadhaar card or some sort of identity like that. And then there is something called private permission, which is what we are going to explore, where the data is also hidden and it's not visible to everybody in the public. It's accessible only to a set of people or some organizations. Some organizations or a couple of organizations. If it involves multiple organizations, we can call it a consortium, which is like almost semi-private sort of setup. Yeah. So now, as I mentioned, so when it comes to proof of work, the way I explained to you about the puzzle, it is not very easy that you solve the puzzle. Like, I mean, whoever solves the puzzle first will be given the authority to make the next block, to put the next block. So that's I mean, that requires you or your computer to be very, should have very high capabilities. So that sort of approach is really not necessary when you come to private and permission setup. So it doesn't really make sense to unnecessarily spend a lot of resources in a private setup. So proof of work doesn't really make much sense uh, when it comes to private and permission setup, and you definitely have to find something else. So there's also one more similar approach called proof of stake, as I told you. So Ethereum should be moving into it soon. So what happens in proof of stake basically is I mean, whoever has the highest stakes in terms of coins or in terms of the wealth that they put across in the network, so they will be given highest priority. Yeah, I mean, the assumption with which this consensus mechanism again works is that whoever has the highest stakes doesn't want to do a fraud and do some invalid transactions. He is at loss. Like if he does some invalid transactions, I mean, if he does some fraud and then the transactions turn out to be invalid, then he'll be charged some penalty. So which is what he doesn't want to do, and then he'll stay. I mean, he'll put his acts in his interest and act in the right direction. So that is one approach that POS follows, but there are some caveats in this approach, because I mean, if somebody has the highest wealth, probably if he owns 30 to 40% of the Bitcoins and 30 to 40% of Ethereum coins, probably Ether. So he would be always mining. So in that case, to solve that issue of centralization, where he will not be given only he will not be given the permission, or only he will not be given the authority to mine all the blocks. So there is some sort of randomization brought in again here. So this problem is solved using two approaches. One is called, generally it may be solved in multiple approaches, but the most popular methods are these two. One is called randomized block selection, where you, whatever the block that is proposed and the amount of stake that a user or the validator or the miner has, so they are weighted together to come up with a value, which will be further used to see whether he would be the one who will be mining the next block. So basically, this is a weighted combination of hash for the block. So the one with the lowest hash will be given the highest rank, some rank 1, rank 2, some sort of ranking will be given, and then the one with highest stake. So you do a weighted combination of these two and then give a rank to the applicant. So to determine if he is the he would be the one who will be going and mining the next block or not. So similarly, there is also one more approach which is called coinage. So here your stake is multiplied by your waiting time. So that gives the actual value or your ranking, uh, which is used to determine if you will be the next person to mine the block. Yeah, so I mean, I have been using the term mining here, but the terms keep changing with respect to consensus algorithms. For example, in proof of work, it's called mining because it has a lot of compute intensive uh, uh, math problem which has to be solved. Coming to proof of stake, they are called forgers, and going ahead with other private sort of approaches that I would explain, they'll be called validators or sealers. So yeah, so there are still some caveats in these approaches that this public blockchains follow. So they are vulnerable to 50%, 51% attack. So with but with the number of nodes that really are present, or with the number of accounts that are really present, it's very difficult to own the 51% of the whole wealth that is there, or the 51% of the entire Bitcoin or the Ether that are available so far. Yeah. So now, so as I told you, you don't need to randomly choose uh, randomly choose somebody among your peers to uh, do a consensus for you, or you don't need to solve a mathematical puzzle to do a consensus for you in a private sort of network. It doesn't really make sense. So in a private network, you generally trust parties. You can elect a few parties who can do consensus for you. So that's where the two consensus algorithms I have mentioned here come up with actually. So in proof of authority, you basically have a set of selected nodes who will do consensus for you. Yeah. So proof of authority is derived from proof of stake. So earlier we used to stake our wealth in POS. Now the stake is basically your identity. So if you do a fraudulent attack at some point being a validator, so your identity is revealed and then you will be penalized, or you'll not be allowed into the network. So there's some sort of penalty that happens here, and this takes care of validators not really doing fraud in their consensus. So you basically select a set of validators, and then they take turns uh, in making consensus. For example, if there are 4 validators, so the next 4 blocks are probably divided among these 4 validators for them to achieve consensus. For example, like block 10 is generated by validator 1, block 11 will be validator 2, block 12 will be validator 3, and things like that. So there is some sort of turns, or some sort of round robin or some approach that's taken where the consensus is divided. The right to consensus, do this generation of uh, next block is given to one of the validators. So one such version of implementation also exists with Ethereum. It's called Click. So as I told you, so if there are 2 validators or multiple validators, the only constraint that Click or the protocol that is implemented, POA protocol that's implemented in Ethereum places, is that consecutive blocks cannot be mined by or sealed by same validator node. So that's the only one constraint that it has. So there's also one more sort of approach. There are a couple of other approaches that private blockchains follow for consensus. One of them is called Raft, which I would explain again. So again, there are multiple validators validating nodes that are present in this network, and then it follows a leader and follower model. Like for example, if there are 4 validators or 4 sealers in the network, so one of them will be called a leader, and all others follow the leader's choice. And I mean, there is also a sort of election that happens with the leader. There are uh, some methodology that is followed in draft, where you elect your leader when one of the nodes, one of the validator nodes finds that he is not able to communicate to leader, he starts an election. So there is an elected leader approach that draft follows. And then basically what happens in this consensus is, whatever the followers, basically when peers forward the transactions to validators for mining or sealing, the follower validators forward the transactions to elected leader. The leader makes it a block and then propagates it back to the uh, other validators for them to validate it and then propagate it further and make it a blockchain again. Yeah. So coming to the use case that we want to address here. So as I was telling you, so our deployment was mostly in one of the community networks in Spain, the region called Catalonia. So we have a community network, wireless mesh network called Goofy.net. So that is where we wanted to address a few problems that were already in our hand. So we wanted to address problems related to automated payments or economic sustainability and things like that. So basically, this at least one subgroup of the community mesh networks consists of 100 to 200 routers. So we wanted to explore how we would bring the blockchains into use here to solve our problems. So again, this was a very private and permission sort of blockchain setup. So we got in two candidates here. So one of them was Hyperledger Fabric, which is very intrinsically developed for such sort of setup, private and permission setup. And then we also, we actually evaluated only only Hyperledger Fabric in the beginning. And then later on at some stage when we, later on at some stage we thought, why not deploy something that is also present as a public blockchain and popular, and see how it really performs in a private and permission setup. So that's when we deployed Ethereum. So these experiments were not conducted in the same timeline. Whenever we deployed Hyperledger Fabric, probably it was in early 2018, January, February 2018. And then the Ethereum deployment took place only probably in August or September 2018, I think. Yeah, so coming to Ethereum, we chose Ethereum with Click, which is a proof of authority based consensus mechanism. That was very, that seemed very suitable for a private and permission network than the other POS or POW that was existing. So let me explain some characteristics of what is Hyperledger Fabric and what exactly is the Ethereum setup looks like. Okay, so Hyperledger Fabric is part of the Hyperledger bigger Hyperledger project under Linux Foundation, where they want to come up with multiple sorts of blockchains for different applications. So Hyperledger Fabric is the most popular one so far, and it's also very suitable for something that we are exploring on. So others, there are other implementations like Burrow, which implements Ethereum. And there's other implementation called Indy, which is on digital identity. So for the application of automating payments or making some simple transactions in a private permission network, Hyperledger Fabric seemed very very suitable. So that's how we identified HLF and went ahead with it. So there are basically three types of nodes in Hyperledger Fabric. So one is called client, where the client is the one who submits transactions. So it's basically very close to the application and wanting to write some data into the network. So a client has to connect to a peer. So let me tell you what is a peer. Peer are the general nodes that are existing in the network. Again, there are two types of peers here. So a general peer which just receives the data and keeps a ledger is called a committer. And there is one special sort of peer called endorser. So endorser basically endorses some transactions. So I'll explain to you further how exactly the transaction flows in case of Hyperledger Fabric. And after the transaction is endorsed and is back with us, it goes to the orderer. Orderer is the one who takes care of this consensus here in a very deterministic sort of approach. Again, I'll explain you why the approach is called why the approach is very called as deterministic approach and not a probabilistic approach which the other blockchains take. So let's jump into this transaction flow. So as I told you, there are three different kinds of nodes. One is client. There are some peers. Some of them may be there may be some more committers as well. So we just represented some endorsing peers here, and some nodes called ordering nodes, which are basically ordering the transactions and putting them block to the blockchain. So whenever a client generates a transaction proposal, so it has to send it to the endorsers, one of the endorsers or all of the endorsers, or probably it sends to one endorser and that endorser takes care of it and pushes it to other endorsers. So what the endorsers do is basically they validate the transaction, they check for the double spending, and they check for the transaction format, they check if everything is fine, and then they endorse saying whether the transaction is valid or invalid, and they endorse it back to the client, and they really don't put it onto the ledger yet. So now once the client receives back the endorsement, it now sends it to the orderer. So I mean, for simplicity, we can assume that orderer is just one node, so where you just send the transactions. So multiple clients can send the transactions to endorse the transactions to orderer, and the orderer orders them in some sort of fashion and puts them back to peers in one defined order. So here, as I told you, simplistically, there may be one orderer, or to avoid, to make it crash failure tolerant, we can have multiple orderers, which again follow some sort of approach of Raft or PBFT, as I told you before. So coming back here, there are few more components in the architecture that are important. But if you see the nodes really run as containers. But the other components of architecture are basically some sort of abstract components, not really running as containers. Though chain code runs as a container, but it still sits on top of endorser. So chain code is the program that is that implements a logic. Basically, if you want to transfer something, probably from say from A to B, you want to transfer 10 amounts of money or something, some 10 units of data or something like that. So this sort of the logic for it is put on top of chain code, and then whenever it wants to transfer some 10 units of bits or 10 units of data to B, it will invoke this chain code on the endorser. So basically, chain code, or in a general term, you can call it as a smart contract. It's a piece of code that implements some sort of application logic here. And coming to the architecture of Hyperledger Fabric, it's not as simple as Ethereum, where Ethereum or Bitcoin, where all nodes are almost similar. So as you see, there are many different sorts of nodes present in this network, and each of them have a different role. So a channel will enable further privacy, or further sort of improvement in we provide hierarchical sort of architecture, giving out some restricted access to components. Like for example, if A wants to transact to B and A wants to transact to C, but there is no, you don't want these transactions of B to C in between. So you can put the transactions of A to B in one channel and transactions of A to C in another channel. So channel is basically a new chain or a side chain. sort of approach that Hyperledger Fabric brings in, where you can restrict permissions even further. Like it's basically like if you consider a Bitcoin or an Ethereum, so all the networks, all the peers in the network have permission to access everything in the network. So this channel enables you, channel and the membership service provider, and together. So they enable you to further divide this network into subnets. That's one sort of approach which is very helpful whenever you're doing consortium blockchains. For example, if I'm a company and I want to do a consortium sort of setup with two other companies, so what I want to share with company B, I don't want to share the same blockchain data with company C. So I can still have a same blockchain setup, but divided into two separate channels and go ahead with the transactions. So that's one very nice sort of feature that Hyperledger Fabric brings in here. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's it about Hyperledger Fabric. So there is one optional feature where the client may be notified about the transactions being committed onto other peers, or this is an optional step. So that's it about it. And yeah, so the other candidate that we chose to deploy on top of the wireless mesh networks is Ethereum, but in a private sort of uh, approach that Ethereum also provided. So Ethereum is called blockchain 2.0 basically because it again builds on, most of the concepts are built on top of Bitcoin, and it's again open cryptocurrency based blockchain implementation. But it brings in the concept of smart contracts. So basically it provides a platform where you can build your decentralized applications, and then as part of blockchains, earlier in Bitcoin only the transactions, the monetary transactions were part of the blockchain. So here in case of Ethereum, even some part of code can be part of the blockchain itself. So that's one improvement or a sort of feature that Ethereum gives you. The whole I mean each node, I mean in case of Ethereum again, like Hyperledger Fabric, there are no different kinds of nodes. There is only one node, and there's something called Ethereum virtual machine which implements this protocol and helps to run it. So there are a couple of implementations that are famous or popular in Ethereum again. So one is called Geth and the other is Parity. We used Geth implementation in our deployment again. So there are, I mean, to explain some components in Ethereum, Ethereum has externally owned, there are two components, major components. One is account addresses, through which you share money. Like for example, A has an address and B has an address. A wants to send money to B using that address. And there's also one more component which is called smart contract, which is a piece of code that is part of deployed as part of blockchain. And then again, even that has an address. So you can call some part of code to be executed with whatever restrictions or the fees that it needs, and then by calling it, invoking it with its address. So that's a few simple features of Ethereum. So going ahead with Ethereum currently the public Ethereum is based on POW, proof of work. It's called ETH hash. So the consensus engine is called ETH hash. So now what we are exploring is another implementation of consensus called proof of authority. Again, it's very less computationally very less expensive compared to proof of work, as I explained you before. And then only a few there'll be a few set of nodes that are designated who will seal these nodes, and they again take turns to seal the blocks, and then put it on top of blockchain. So basically now there are only two types of nodes. One who keep committing the data or the committing the blocks on top of blockchain, and they're called non-sealer nodes. And there are a few which also seal the blocks and propagate the new blocks. So those are called sealers or validators. So just to compare, I think I spoke about most of the comparison that I wanted to give with respect to Hyperledger Fabric and Ethereum. But one important thing that I want to talk about is probably consensus. So the consensus in, if you see the consensus in Hyperledger Fabric, there is, whatever the orderer gives you is a final sort of validated block of data. You don't need to wait for further blocks to validate it. But however, in Ethereum, that's not true. You have to wait for some more blocks to accumulate, so that to be sure it's not forked out. So that's one approach. So basically, Ethereum follows a uh, uh, way of finalizing a transaction, not really the deterministic fashion that Hyperledger Fabric follows. And then coming to extent of decentralization, as you can see, Ethereum is more decentralized because it was basically built for a public platform. But however, Hyperledger Fabric has very hierarchical structure. It can be very centralized in some of the implementations. If you see, for example, if you have only one orderer and one endorser, and both of them lie with the same person or same node, it's like everything is again back to be controlled by only one person. This is like very centralized fashion. So you can, the extent of decentralization is high in Ethereum and it's very less in Hyperledger Fabric. However, we want to explore both of them in mesh networks and see how it really goes. So now coming to what really stops us from putting these blockchains on top of edges. Just a quick check of time. Okay. Arjuna, how long do you have more?
We have about the 12 minutes, Anirudh.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Fine. I think I'll rush through. So yeah, for edge computing, when you talk of edge computing, basically, we talk of devices that are resource constrained. If you consider routers or mobile phones, they don't really have much of CPU capability. So they're computing capability. So that's one thing that we were concerned of when we are putting blockchains on top of it, because in the early days of blockchain, before the arrival of whatever consensus mechanism I was mentioning for private networks, so these seem very compute intensive. So it was almost like impossible to put blockchains on top of it. But then with coming up of these new sort of approaches for consensus, which are less compute intensive, we thought why not try and see if the blockchains, which we think could really solve our problems, can also be put on edge devices like this. So a few enablers for these edge computing or some virtualization platforms like unikernels and Dockers, basically. So that's what I started exploring. Unikernels, it was not very easy for me to really port something, a blockchain node onto a unikernel. There's no platform available, or there are a lot of constraints. So then we saw that Docker containers were already present and it was easily buildable and deployable. So we went ahead with Docker containers. Maybe this, whatever I'm talking is before 2 years. Probably there may be some unikernels of blockchain nodes which may exist now. So probably now we can go ahead and explore on unikernels as well, I think. But yeah, we went ahead and explored on Docker containers rather. So Docker also facilitated something called Swarm. So you can create a network of containers as a sub network within your network. So that was one very good feature for blockchains to run on top of it. So we went ahead and deployed, used Docker containers to deploy Hyperledger Fabric and Geth, which is again Ethereum implementation. So why we think this marriage was necessary, or this combination of edge computing and blockchains was necessary is, so it was a very like 100 to 200 routers in a setup, and then we didn't have any centralized servers as such to solve, to provide some services. So we thought, why not, since these routers also were belonging to the community, and then it was crowdsourced sort of approach that we followed. Why not keep the entire network still decentralized and put some services on edge? For example, something like local online marketing, like have a web page for some local sellers, or then usage tracking, payments, etc. So the usage tracking and payments, etc., is what we wanted to actually explore more, and then went ahead. So the usage tracking basically needs some sort of untampered data, right? I mean, you can't just allow the data to be tampered by anybody and then say you have done this much usage. So the customers will not really agree with that. So that sort of pushed us to put blockchains on top of it and see how untampered data, usage data, can be recorded on top of edges as well. So this was our setup. There is a real community mesh network. So the white ones are the routers, Wi-Fi routers, and we put 10 Raspberry Pi boards on just behind some of the routers, well-connected routers. And then we actually did a lot of experiments to actually look at the performance of transaction latencies as well. But since I'm talking more of edge computing than mesh networking, I thought I'll talk of the other part of the experiment that we did, which was to actually see how the resource consumption happened when we deployed blockchains on top of the Raspberry Pi boards. So yeah, our setup, as I told you, I think the setup was basically some Docker containers. So some of the nodes, some of the Raspberry Pi boards had peers. Some of them had endorsers when it comes to Apple Fabric, peers, endorsers, and some of them had orderers. But yeah, so we went ahead with only one orderer and not multiple orderers, because back then there was no Raft technique for Hyperledger Fabric that was allowed. There's only one. There's only Kafka, which was very. I mean, it was not very easy to implement that. So we left at it, and then we wanted to just explore to see how really the Hyperledger Fabric performs and see. So we went ahead and put one orderer, a couple of peers, and then one endorser, two, three, four endorsers, and then tried to record some measurements. So to record resource consumption measurements, we did this experiment. Like from one client in a peer, we parallelly fired 100 transactions, saying say 100 transactions of some. For example, A wants to send something to B, some 10 units of money or something to B. Then you send 10 units of money 100 times parallelly. So that's what we did to record the measurements. So these are the results of those measurements. So if you really see here, so there are three CPU utilization graphs that are present, which give you the utilization of endorser, ordering, and committer. Committer is a normal peer. So ordering was the least loaded, and then there was committer. Committer was also not loaded to very high extent, but endorser was very highly loaded. That was because also there is some chain code that was running on top of endorser. So that is one we could see with respect to 100 transactions. And then we also checked the memory footprints, and we found that endorser had the highest memory consumption here compared to orderer and committer. But however, we still find that the memory footprint of Hyperledger Fabric on Raspberry Pi was pretty high compared to the RAM. I'll tell you why going further, because if you see our Ethereum graphs, so the black lines are the ones which indicate the memory here. So when we fired 100 transactions parallelly, we could hardly see any memory consumption. So it was only 10-15%. So that was like very less memory consumption, memory footprint that Ethereum had. And also even the CPU consumption with 100 transactions with both sealer and non-sealer node was not high. So then we just wanted to see how it performs with 1,000 transactions fired parallelly. So we fired some 1,000 transactions parallelly and saw the non-sealer node where we fired transactions was loaded, but the sealer was still not loaded. So if you really plan your network, form a strategy where you can where you can have these transactions with multiple non-sealer nodes, push these transactions with multiple non-sealer nodes. So that would really solve this problem. That is one thing. And then so there is something called endorsement policy when it comes to Hyperledger Fabric. So if you see here, we had this experiment of resource consumption was done with only one endorser, but we could have multiple endorsers and reduce the load on endorser as well. So there is a design philosophy that is allowed in Hyperledger Fabric, where you can divide this load of endorsing to multiple endorsers. So I think, if you see both Hyperledger Fabric and Ethereum it was fairly possible to implement them on top of very small devices, which was very surprising to us. So Ethereum was not really surprising to us. The first experiment that we did was Hyperledger Fabric. This gave out. This was pretty surprising because we never thought it was so simple or so. Even with such resource constrained devices, we would be able to continue and deploy blockchains. So that was one very good learning that we had. So yeah, I think we can. Some learnings we had is we learned that we could still deploy blockchains. They're not very heavy. With some sort of design approaches, we could deploy them on edges and then solve the problems that we thought blockchain could solve, and still solve it without any centralized server and central server with heavy computation capabilities. We can solve it with even simple edge components is what we conclude here.
Great.
That's it, I think. So couple of references, and thanks to all of you.